Hello class, welcome to the second part of our lecture series on the Spanish-American War. We left off talking about the effect that yellow journalism had on the Americans' desire to become involved in the Cuban Revolution against the Spanish Empire. Part of the reason that the yellow journalists had so much material to use to support the war was the Spanish policy of reconcentration. Basically, the Spanish Empire was trying to end the Cuban Revolution by throwing all the Cubans into these concentration camps where they were not fed and many people died of disease. So people were seeing the pictures of these concentration camps, and Americans were very upset that this was happening so near to the United States, and they felt that the United States should do something to end this persecution of the Cubans. As was said in the lecture before, most U.S. policymakers did not believe that the United States should get involved in the Cuban Revolution against the Spanish. However, as time went along, people in the government began to believe that maybe some sort of reaction should occur. So President McKinley, not necessarily because he believed that the Cubans were being treated wrongly or being oppressed, but because he wanted to protect American property on the island of Cuba, sent a warship called the USS Maine to Cuba, just outside, floating in the waters next to Cuba, to tell the Spanish basically that if the Spanish in any way attack U.S. property on the island of Cuba, there would be a reaction by the United States. So you have to imagine that this U.S. warship is sitting just off the coast of Cuba. And then on February 15th, 1898, the complete unexpected happens. An explosion sends the ship's ammunition up in flames, and the USS Maine explodes and sinks, and it kills 260 of the 350 naval officers who were on that ship. Okay, so if you can imagine, during this time of yellow journalism, during this time where the U.S. media really wants the United States to go to war and to be involved in this crisis, people like William Hearst started writing. So if we look at this newspaper by one of these yellow journalists, we can see how the Americans got their news and how these stories were being told to them. So if you look at the top, you have the headline of the USS Maine being sunk. Okay, so it says, "Maine explosion caused by a bomb or torpedo." In the headline, you don't see any question about whether there might have been an accident. Maybe the ship sunk itself. Maybe there was an explosion caused by a mistake made by either the engineers who designed the ship or possibly somebody who was working in the coal pits to make the ship run. Then as you move down further, you see the paragraph that discuss how a Dr. E.C. Pendleton, who just arrived from Havana, said he overheard talk about a plot to blow up the ship. So you see within just the headlines a rumor that was going around about possibly the Spanish trying to blow up the ship. And then also, even more importantly, we can see how the yellow journalists work by, you see this huge photo that covers the whole front page of this newspaper. Excuse me, it's not a photo, it's an illustration. Was there a photo of how the USS Maine exploded? Of course not. But you can imagine that the editors of this newspaper wanted to make the event a huge, largely dramatic explosion that killed American naval men, and therefore, if you combine this illustration with these very dramatic headlines, Americans truly believed that the United States should go to war with Spain and should attempt to help the Cuban revolutionaries where they could. In fact, many historians even nowadays believe that the USS Maine exploded because there was some sort of defect or a problem going on within the engines, and that in fact it's likely that the Spanish did not blow up the USS Maine. But as I said, this is a time where the Americans feel like they should be involved in should be involved in international conflicts, especially if they're in the Western Hemisphere, so near to the United States. As I said before the sinking of the USS Maine, U.S. policymakers, including most importantly President McKinley, did not believe that the United States should be involved in a war with the Spanish Empire. However, after the USS Maine explosion, President McKinley is pressured by American citizens, by politicians, by everybody who is upset that so many U.S. servicemen who were working on the USS Maine were killed, and that so many media sources were saying that this was a Spanish attack. Therefore, on April 20th, 1898, President McKinley had no choice but to go to Congress and ask permission to go to war with Spain. Okay, so the United States by April 20th, 1898, largely because of the explosion of the USS Maine, goes to war with Spain and is now involved with the revolution, the Cuban Revolution against the Spanish Empire. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, and this is before he becomes President of the United States, he is the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So you have a top general who is the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and then you have Teddy Roosevelt just below him. Okay. In February, Teddy Roosevelt actually orders the Pacific Fleet, which is off of which is near China during this time. So we have U.S. naval ships near China during this time, around February. Teddy Roosevelt orders George Dewey, the commander of this Pacific Fleet, on May 1st to attack the Spanish fleet, or the Spanish ships which are controlling the Philippine Islands. Okay, so the Philippine Islands are all the way into Asia, close to China, completely separated from Cuba, and Teddy Roosevelt, it was his idea to send the U.S. Pacific Fleet to take these islands from the Spanish. Okay, so this is very important because do the Philippines have anything to do with what's going on in Cuba? No, of course not. But this is a war against the Spanish, okay? And Teddy Roosevelt believes that he is one of these imperialists, meaning he's one of these people who believes that the United States will be better, will be more powerful if it takes more land and takes more islands. So on May 1st, George Dewey, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, completely destroys the Spanish fleet, and the United States now has control over the Philippine Islands. So as we can see from this map, Dewey and the Pacific Fleet are stationed off of Hong Kong and China. So when they receive the word from Teddy Roosevelt to attack the Philippine Islands, they just head south, hit the Philippine Islands, and the Spanish fleet was very weak in comparison to the new naval power of the United States, and they fell easily to the U.S. So now, because of the Spanish-American War, the United States has control over the Philippine Islands.